From Chicago, welcome to 3 Degrees Discussions. I'm Caroline Vasquez, and for today, I'm your host. I'm here to bring you a special story of an innovator, entrepreneur, and leader in the 3D printing industry.
And on the flip side, if you're a small, medium-sized manufacturer, like to invest a few $1 million into this equipment, like that's a big gamble, big risk. And who's going to operate it? Where's the workforce coming from? And there's already a manufacturing workforce shortage. And so that was really kind of like, how can we solve some of those issues? And certainly being in Chicago, like there are no shortage of big companies, as well as kind of a workforce that could use new ideas for emerging industries.
That was Dr. Mike Vasquez. Mike is usually the host of this podcast and is the founder of two 3D printing companies. He started his first company, 3Degrees, in 2013, and since then has helped both global companies and family-run businesses navigate the challenges and opportunities of 3D printing. In talking with hundreds of companies, he kept seeing a need for tracking software customized to this space. He couldn't find a solution that did what he thought was necessary, so instead, he built one and started his second company, TraceAM. In celebration of the 50th episode of this podcast, he agreed to let me take over the mic and ask the questions. You'll learn what he thinks is next for 3D printing, how his love of sports was a catalyst for his career, and what his experience has been as an entrepreneur. Before we get started, head over to www.3degreescompany.com and subscribe to the podcast. Remember, you can listen to the show anywhere you download your podcasts, including Spotify, Apple, Amazon, or Stitcher. Hi, Mike.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm doing well.
So we are here to celebrate episode 50 of 3 Degrees Discussions, which I said when you launched this, when you got to 50, I was going to make you be the guest. So tables turned. Welcome to your show.
Yes, I'm happy to be here. Happy to make it to 50. Almost just under a year, I think.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what has been the most surprising thing for you in hosting a podcast?
I think the consistency of the stories of how people got into 3D printing. I think that's kind of where I started, was like, I've met so many interesting people in the space, and a lot of different career paths, engineering and designing, but most of them kind of consistently across the board have just stumbled into 3D printing into their career. It wasn't something that they had on their to-do list. I mean, that makes sense because the industry is not that old, but of the people that I spoke to, kind of that was something that is a common theme. And it's interesting, hopefully, as other people listen to this, and now there's degree programs at universities that maybe 3D printing is an actual career path, and you get to kind of hear the difference into someone who's like kind of evolved as the industry has evolved versus kind of a little bit more mature, and now there's actual jobs and job postings about it.
Yeah. So do you follow that path as well? What was your experience?
I would probably say so. I think when I was in school, I wanted to do something around sports engineering. I mean, that was my entire focus. I designed baseball bats for Easton. I played baseball. I worked in a sports innovation lab at MIT, designed catcher's equipment, and then went off to do a PhD where I was designing snowboard equipment or helping to design materials around snowboarding. And so I really thought that I was going to be doing something related to sports. Mm-hmm. And there's a whole industry around that. It's still somewhat niche in terms of broader engineering, but all the big companies, Nike and Adidas and Under Armour, like they all have kind of sports engineers, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. Yeah. But along the way, I mean, I think there was a common thread of 3D printing that kind of evolved. First, when I was at MIT, I did a project with New Balance, looking at how do you economically scale 3D printing for shoes. That was really interesting, partially for the materials side, but partially more so from economics and like technical need to deploy technology like that.
Mhm.
And then when I went to England, to Loughborough, to do the PhD, it was all focused on, it was kind of I knew I wanted to work with Burton and kind of the sports engineering group at Loughborough, but like this project was specific around 3D printing and the materials around 3D printing, which I was a good fit for given a background in material science. And so kind of stumbled into it. Still even doing that, I got to be inundated in 3D printing on a day-to-day basis, but didn't think that I would entirely focus on 3D printing afterwards. And so it wasn't something like, I probably remember a conversation or two with Neil and Candace, my advisors there, that as they were asking me like, what do you want to do with when I finish, like I would probably say sports, something sports engineering related. We even had a podcast. My friend Henry and I had a podcast about sports technology at the time. So it wasn't 3D printing focused. So I would fit that mold.
Do you have a sense of who is listening? Who's heard the first 50 episodes?
I have some sense, and it's pretty interesting just across the board. Certainly we had the A-Mug show a few weeks ago in Florida where you get to actually see people for the first time in 18 months since this started. And so like heard from people that, hey, like I've listened to your show or at least seen it. I think that's probably more common. I don't have a good sense of I have rough sense of numbers in terms of who's listening, but certainly a lot more people have seen, hey, like you interviewed a friend of mine, or I've listened to a handful of episodes. And so I think it's kind of a mix of folks that are kind of established in the industry. Maybe I'm interviewing a friend of theirs or a colleague or someone that they work with. But also I think a fair amount of, I would say, young engineers or people in their younger point of their careers.
Sure.
Maybe learning.
Because historically, it's been a pretty small group, right? Like it seems to me that everybody in the 3D printing world like has overlapped somewhere, some project at some time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. It's still fairly small, and the network is certainly growing, and the spread of the technology is growing. But that means that there's a lot more people wanting to learn more about the industry. But certainly, any conference that you go to, or even all the virtual conferences that we've had over the last year, you kind of see the same names and faces and things, which is, it gives, I kind of like it because it gives some context to the history of the technology and where it's come from, which is also one of the reasons why I started it. Was I think there's no shortage of kind of, I don't know, maybe puff pieces or case studies or like all the good that goes in, like all the positive like stories around the technology and media and stuff. But there's a lot of work that goes into those, and there's a lot of context of like, hey, this idea started at this company or this university out of this work. And so a lot of the stories that we get into with these are early kind of career points in many folks' trajectory. So we get to hear some of that as well.
Yeah. Well, and that picks up on something that I've always thought was interesting about your perspective on this, which is, I've been going to 3D printing courses since before we were even married, right? And I've often joked that you're kind of the realist in the room. Like you've never really bought into the hype that, I asked you like, are we gonna have a 3D printer and print our own silverware someday? And you're like, yeah, I don't think that's where this is going. So I'm curious, sort of, it feels like the industry's gone through a bit of a sea change over the last couple of years, in it really moving from just prototyping and other things to really end products. What are your thoughts as the realist on sort of what the next 5 years in the space are going to look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think over the last few years, certainly there's a lot of different players in the market, whether that's material suppliers, whether that's people printing parts, whether that's machine manufacturers or different types of technology, which makes it more and more, don't know if challenging is the right word, maybe confusing is a better word for people that are companies that are looking to actually use the technology in an effective way. You kind of have to have this somewhat like baseline knowledge of all these different technologies to evaluate which one is the right choice, if there's any for me. And so I think there's kind of currently we're still going through that maturation process as a industry where like there are certainly industries that have gone through the qualification of parts and have developed technologies that work for them for specific portfolios of components. But I think a lot of the way that this industry speaks around the maturation of the industry is just through like, hey, can we get the right materials? Can we get the right machine at the right cost? But I think it's more broad than that in terms of like, can we get the right team around this that is willing to be patient or has the right budget or has the right timeline or the right skill set to actually effectively deploy a solution. And so I think it's not always just about, okay, can I get this machine at the right cost to replace these set of parts? And so I think that you need that, like you have to have a material, the stainless steel has to act like stainless steel, or nylon 12 has to act like nylon 12, but that's getting better. You can quantify that a little bit, but I think the enterprise around building teams in the space and helping to think through what are the right applications, because I think the design part still comes into it. It's like, it's not just replacing a one-to-one part. In some cases it is, but in many cases to really get the true value, because the machines are still expensive, the materials are expensive, the people that run them are expensive. You have to think a little bit more broadly, and that takes, in some cases, an organization that's a little bit open-minded to do that. But I think that we're getting there. Do
you see that in the conversations? I mean, obviously you sit with 3Degrees as, a consultant that gets brought into a lot of these large companies trying to figure it out. Are you getting different questions from them today than you were getting when you launched the business 7 years ago? 8 years ago?
Yeah, 2013.
Yeah.
So, yes, I think people are more comfortable with the lingo. They realize, like when I first started, there wasn't like no appreciation that there are different types of 3D printers, like FDM or filament based or powder based or metals. I think people are more comfortable with that aspect of it, which helps a lot. And so I think they come into it knowing that, hey, like we've got a lot of options out here. Where do we start? Like what's low hanging fruit? And have an appreciation that it's not, it can be beyond prototyping, but to get beyond prototyping into production is a lot of work.
Yeah. So is that still the entry point for most of your clients? Are most of them coming in with, we don't have any 3D printing yet and we're looking to have some? Or do you have people now who are, hey, we've been doing it in this small sort of sandbox testing arena and we want to figure out kind of how to level it up? We see a lot of opportunity.
I'd say it's both. I'd say more so on the second side, where there's like, how do we mature the technology or take it to the next level where, okay, if we're just doing prototyping, we don't have to worry about where our materials come from or even the cost to some extent, because usually it's cheaper on the prototyping side, but how do you scale it out in terms of qualifying or validating a process, and what are the right standards to use? Who are our vendors, and all of that comes into play.
Yeah. Okay. So we're actually not in the same location today. Sign of world going back to some version of normal. You're at our house. I'm in my office. But obviously, you have grown 3Degrees. You've launched your software company during COVID. We worked from home with 2 toddlers. You're doing a lot less travel. I think everybody right now is thinking about what just happened in my life, and what of that world do I want to continue to adopt? And sort of what am I excited to get back to? And so I'm curious, as an entrepreneur, business owner, what has the experience over the last 15 months been like for you?
Sure. I mean, I think it's certainly been different than what it was before. But I think with that, certainly early on, February, March time, like no one knew what to expect, right? Like there's so many unknowns. But it quickly, well, not quickly, but like you kind of got to a status quo at some point once you saw the lockdowns happening and what was locked down, what was okay, what was not okay, what were the right precautions. I think that just turned into a new status quo or a new kind of baseline where, okay, where's the opportunity in this? And I think from my perspective, that's what I wanted to try and take away from it is, and always in terms of the outlook is, okay, like, yeah, there are terrible aspects of this in terms of kind of human costs and life costs for COVID, but from kind of a business perspective, what are some of the opportunities that we could take advantage of from as a small company, and those kind of doing things like the podcast and reaching a different audience. I think the other piece of it really was how is the conversation more broadly around manufacturing and supply chains kind of coming into the everyday conversation that people are sitting and having on their couch during Netflix, because like you had this, okay, there's no toilet paper. Like, what does that mean? Like, okay, that means somewhere that we either don't have enough supply of raw material, or there's a plant that's closing, or it can't get across borders. And so you saw these kind of real life aspects of manufacturing and supply chains kind of coming into everyday lingo, and people are talking about it. Similarly with like just keeping plants open, and like, where do you find employees? Like, how do you keep them safe? And so I think the conversation around kind of US based manufacturing really grew. There was kind of rumblings of that over the last few years, certainly, but I think it was more pointed.
Catalyst for.
Yeah. And I think as well as there's, because it was so visible to everyday people, like politicians took notice and say, okay, we need to put some money behind this. And so now there's big initiatives to address some of these efforts that are already ongoing. So with the PPE, for instance, like there's organizations like America Makes that are formalizing that with the FDA and making sure things are safe, that are 3D printed. Also other.
That was that was like a huge story for a while, right? Was everybody was going to 3D print ventilator parts.
Right. Absolutely. And I think it served its purpose well in terms of kind of, is there a stopgap that you can kind of use 3D printing for as you ramp up to more efficient, cost-effective types of solutions as people retool. So I think there were a lot of great examples of that. We worked a little bit with M-Hub, which is a local Chicago innovation hub, which my usual office is at, to do some collaborative work with Northwestern University and some other partners to do some of that work. But there was great examples of that. Everyone I talked to in the 3D printing realm at AMUG, like they were all doing something to support that. So I think that was great to see.
Because it kind of is the thesis, right, of 3D printing, which is you can rapidly evolve designs. You can print it much more quickly than a traditional send it somewhere, make the mold first, inject it sort of stuff, right? So, I mean, it really helped, I think, a lot of people probably see the value of the technology. I can print it, I can demo it, I can reprint it all in a day if I need to.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think there's benefit to that thinking and showing that with kind of established manufacturing companies, where the idea to gain efficiency is to optimize how you make a single product as much as you can, right? If I'm Coke bottling cans, like I need to optimize that as much as I can to save half a penny. And that makes sense. But more and more, like what's the future business models going to look like for small, medium-sized manufacturers that may do one-off customized things or smaller volumes or kind of retool and say, hey, we've been working in medical, but if we have a 3D printer, maybe we can do some medical, or we have some of the same skill sets to do oil and gas or electric vehicles or aerospace. And I just talked to a woman who runs her family's manufacturing business in Italy, and they got a 3D printer, production 3D printer a few years ago, and primarily they were in oil and gas, but now they're getting all these different customers and from a lot of different industries that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And so I think it's kind of a tool that opens up some different conversations.
Did you have any clients who faced true manufacturing challenges just because of how shut down China was for a pretty prolonged period of time?
We certainly knew of material shortages, not necessarily because of China, but I think there were some other issues that came about, certainly in terms of getting raw materials and delays in production. Early on, I think that was the case. I know this is January time, some of the people we were working with, just the factories were shut down right after kind of the Chinese New Year in 2020. And so that certainly caused delays. But for the most part, kind of manufacturing did stay, the light stayed on. It was a critical industry in most places, but there were other aspects. I mean, probably more impactful. Just as impactful was things like the Texas freeze, where many polymer companies kind of had delays in their raw production and other things like that.
Yeah. Okay. Switching gears a little bit, you talked about companies who need to figure out how to validate parts, track parts as part of that ecosystem switch from maybe just prototypes to more end user products. So part of what you did during COVID was took Trace, your software company, to the next level. I'm guessing listeners would be curious to know kind of why does the market need that sort of tool, and who should be calling you looking for a demo?
Sure. So Trace is a online kind of database tool specifically designed for 3D printing and to manage all of the information that is generated when you go to start a build, complete a build, manage your materials. And so the whole idea kind of started about 3 years ago when we were working with all these companies to help them stand up production facilities. They spend $500,000, $2 million on machines and get someone trained up and they're kind of get their VIPs in and show the machine, hey, it works. But then there's really this challenge across the industry. It doesn't matter, big companies, small companies, how do you manage that information and data that's generated each time you do a build to different degrees, whether it's for full production or managing quality or validating a new R&D material. Everyone was using Excel across the board. There's kind of one or two examples maybe of someone hacking together something else. And so I thought, hey, we can do better than that and add a price point as well that's accessible. One of the challenges in the 3D printing world right now is everything is expensive. Materials are expensive. The machines are expensive. The software is really expensive. And that just is prohibitive to adoption. It makes it more risky to do anything and extends the timeline of adoption. And so Trace essentially kind of came about because I kind of put together a series of PowerPoint slides to say, hey, if I had something that went from this page to this page to this page that followed the 3D printing workflow. And so at step 1, I can enter my design and file information. At step 2, I can write my materials information. At step 3, I can write what machine and process details I was doing. And then subsequently the inspection and all the data that comes around validating the parts. That would be great. And so we've launched Trace. It's a kind of web-based tool that you can kind of log into. You see an interface that has all your projects and all your builds identified on there. It's kind of a repository for all this kind of digital information that otherwise would just be scattered in someone's email or on an Excel spreadsheet or just handwritten somewhere. And really the idea is to allow users a simple way to manage it. So engineers can use it, the operators can input data into it and use it, and decision makers can kind of see visibility into the shop. But also, I think to be able to maybe do some forecasting, have that level of traceability, so that if something does go wrong or you start to get some parts out that don't always look the way they should, you have an easy way to kind of trace back and say, hey, like these parts came out weird starting early in May. That was about the same time we had a big maintenance effort on the machine. What changed? And so you can, rather than recalling an entire line of products, you can pinpoint what the issue was.
Yeah. I mean, I remember early on in our discussions, you thought, well, as you think about what's happening in the medical space and in the aerospace space, my mom's going to have her knee replaced in October. You've jokingly told me she's probably getting some 3D printed part shoved in her knee. At some point, if something were to go wrong with it, I would want them to be able to go back through, right, and say, oh, that was part of this batch of materials printed on this machine. No, we've not had any other defects come out of that. So I know that that's one use case. We talked about materials shortages. Obviously, if you can do some forecasting, you're probably better able to manage kind of the inventory of raw materials you want to have at your disposal for some lead time. What other use cases have surprised you as you've started to talk to people and built out the tool itself?
Yeah. So initially, like kind of the idea was like to get into individual shops and areas to have them use as an in-house tool. But over the last kind of 6 months, and now we've got this project with America Makes and the Air Force, actually using it as a kind of broader repository for materials data and information and build information from real live parts and real live operations. And so what I mean by that, and kind of the essence of this project that we're doing with America Makes and the Air Force, is to take all these different projects that have been funded to look at different materials, different processes with different companies, and put it in one centralized place. And so kind of this fall, we're kind of building on top of that idea to kind of have a centralized real life data repository for 3D printing and kind of building that out to a broader audience, both for just information purposes, so that you can see, okay, how does this machine run at this different setting, or these different types of materials and parts, and compare that over time. But the next iteration really is to use this to help kind of companies build out their qualification and calibration process. Because right now, if you're a small, medium-sized manufacturer, you typically don't have a lot of the inspection material or machinery in-house. And so, and in many cases, it's unclear what should you be doing every build, every month, every quarter to track that. And so kind of the next iteration of Trace is to have a accessible tool that people can use almost as a subscription to say, okay, we need to do this build every month, get these parts tested, and have that repository. So it's clear in one place and allows users to keep their machines in spec and
have confidence, right, in what they're building.
Certainly for new customers, for existing customers to show, or even a differentiator to say, hey, we know our machines are in spec and here's our data to prove it.
Yeah. So clearly, you're running two companies, you're a serial entrepreneur, which I admire. Was that always your plan? Is running your own thing? What about that kind of makes you tick?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it was always I don't think it was probably not always the plan. But at this point, I like doing it. I like having the flexibility to kind of work on the different projects that I want to, and that I think offer a lot of value, but also flexibility in other ways. We can, we have 2 little kids, so I can be home pretty regularly when need be to get them or take care of them. We can have flexibility in terms of some travel and whatnot. And I can go to the gym in the middle of the day if I wanted. And
the gym that is right next to where you're filming.
That's right. That's right.
The Peloton and your, how many pounds are you up to now on your kettlebell crazy Turkish get-ups?
Yes. The 70-pound kettlebells in the background. And so I really like that aspect, and having the ability to see opportunities and make an instant decision on, like, is that something to experiment with? I mean, like the podcast, right? Like it was an idea. Took a couple weeks to get the microphones and all that, but like it wasn't that long before I got the first episode online and kind of keep the cadence, and I can change it when I want to. So I think that aspect is what I really enjoy about the serial entrepreneur or small business world, but also it's not come without challenges and things. And so that level of being able to think creatively and kind of grit through different periods of uncertainty is part of it as well.
Yeah. Is there an in-house, like, corporate job that would ever entice you to leave the startup world behind?
Never say never. I don't know what it might be. I mean, it might not even be 3D printing related. So, so I'm always open-minded to that, and it's always worth growing in different ways. And I've really only worked at this company. I had an internship at 3M, but that was years ago at this point. So it's, I think it's always good to keep open-minded about that sort of thing.
Yeah. Did you love to build things as a kid? Like, were you into like modeling and solving complex problems? And like, was there something in the ethos of your childhood that, like, you look back on what you're doing now and you say, like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense given who I, was as a kid?
It was like Legos and things like that. Well, that's kind of a generic answer. I mean, I think the reason I became a materials engineer was that I love playing baseball. I still play baseball. And every year when I was in high school, they would come out with this new bat made of a different material. It was aluminum, then graphite, then carbon fiber. And I always thought, like, hey, like, somebody somewhere that's their job is to make baseball bats. and so that sounded pretty cool. And I also like kind of the baseball team aspect of like kind of diverse.
Still in my office. I lost my lights.
Kind of diverse teams and people from different walks of life, like having to come together to support a single effort. And so kind of the combination of those two kind of really kind of propelled me down the path of engineering and materials. And I mean, that was my first internship. I worked at Easton Sports out in Van Nuys, California, testing carbon fiber baseball bats. And so,
was it everything you thought it would be when you were the kid, knowing somebody was out there doing that?
It was pretty fun. I mean, I think it was certainly kind of fun. I got to use some of these propped up, souped up bats that were certainly illegal, and got to play baseball all summer. And there's a batting cage in the office and a hockey rink because they make skates and hockey sticks too. So I would say it was a pretty good first experience at the workforce. Yeah.
For parents out there, like you talked about, right, that 3D printing is sort of going through this maturation process, and now you're starting to maybe have degree programs. Are there, things that parents could be doing if they want to get their kids interested in something like 3D printing? I mean, what are your thoughts on like the little desktop printers?
I think those are awesome. I mean, they're still decently expensive, a few $100s. So it's not trivial, but if you're going to spend something like spend money in an Xbox or something like that, it's not that much different. And I think the awesome thing that I'm seeing more and more is like most schools, elementary, high school, like have some sort of 3D printer in the facility. And people are aware of what it does. It may not be like the huge production printers, like they're $1 million, but at least it gives people the ability to build something, see a vision, put it on the screen, and see it manufactured in front of them. I think that's very powerful. We just this week I spoke to another guest who runs an elementary school, or kind of a school for kids that have a lot of issues are usually under state kind of care, and they use 3D printing on a day-to-day basis to produce kind of little projects and do competitions and kind of visualize some of their anxieties and stresses into physical parts and helps them kind of separate that. And so I think there's just so many opportunities to accompany the value of making something with your hands or putting something together that you made. I think that's very impactful for kids. And I think is something that most areas, I think nowadays, even public libraries, there's innovation spaces across the country. So no matter where you are, there might be kind of do some quick searches of 3D printing hubs or maker spaces that you could go check out. And they love usually having kids kind of come by.
Yeah. So because you're not busy enough, you're also launching a summer apprenticeship program here in Chicago with Westside Forward. I'm curious sort of what inspired that. And, is there a particular industry problem that you're trying to solve with that initiative?
Sure. So over the last few years, we get to interface with a lot of different companies, and there's kind of two big problems that we see on a consistent basis. One is that if we're all to believe the hype of 3D printing, that significantly more parts are going to be 3D printed and manufactured. All these big companies, the Boeings, the Fords, the GMs of the world are investing millions of dollars into it. Like there's got to be some sustained supply chain in the US or nearby to make some of those parts. And right now that it's not really, doesn't exist. And on the flip side, if you're a small, medium-sized manufacturer, like to invest a few $1 million into this equipment, like that's a big gamble, big risk. And who's going to operate it? Where's the workforce coming from? And there's already a manufacturing workforce shortage. And so that was really kind of like, how can we solve some of those issues? And certainly being in Chicago, like there's no shortage of big companies, as well as kind of a workforce that could use new ideas for emerging industries, and kind of partnering with the Westside Forward community organization on the west side of Chicago. We're kind of putting together this summer kind of intro to 3D printing careers course to really kind of maybe shed some light on what does a career in manufacturing look like in 2021, because it's not kind of conventionally what people think it was. And I think the industry as a whole, maybe kind of the population in general, has kind of not cast manufacturing into a great light, and for good reason, right? Like it was, you have all the stories of, okay, like the company sent my dad's job away, then he was unemployed, or it's a dirty job. Like every article you read is how AI and robotics are going to replace all the manufacturing here. So like, why would anyone want to go work in that environment?
Sure.
It doesn't seem like just on the face value, like a good career choice.
Well, or that it's like the tale of two worlds, right? Like, I think there was then this perception that manufacturing actually pivoted into the PhDs, and the engineers are now the ones doing the manufacturing because they're running the machines, and there is no longer a workforce that supports that. And I think, it's an interesting myth that you've helped me understand isn't really true. And the jobs, that are open for people who are willing to do some retraining, which doesn't have to be super intensive, are fairly well paying, and they can kind of pick from a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think there's a lot of skills that it doesn't require a college degree, and there's skills that you can build within an organization to learn different machines that are transferable across different companies. Like if you learn how to do measurement or inspection or operate a machine, like every day you see more and more 3D printing facilities and manufacturing sites trying to scale up and get workforce, but they're always complaining. Like I had a call today, like someone can't find enough people to do this stuff. So I think the jobs are out there, and it's trying to match that up a little bit with a community that may not be aware of what kind of a career looks like in 3D printing. So
yeah. So if any listeners are interested in sort of supporting the apprentices you'll have this summer, are there opportunities for people not in Chicago or in Chicago to get engaged?
For sure. I mean, we're always looking for places that students can go work afterwards. We're also kind of building out a mentorship program within this. So we're going to get, in addition to kind of taught curriculum on site and some tours, every student will have a mentor accompanying them through the kind of virtually, kind of helping them through the course, really to build their network, right? We kind of talked about early on is that this is a small community. And so if you can meet some people in this space, and many of the mentors have been guests of my podcast, that kind of gives you a big lead into kind of where you could get your first job or first experience. So happy to tell people more. My email is Mike at 3Degrees Company. The organization is called West Side Forward. So there's some more information on that site as well about the application, the actual program too.
Cool. So you and I love to play games of Q&A. Are you up for a little quick lightning round with me?
Sure.
All right. Early bird or night owl, Mike?
Early bird.
You want to tell everybody how early you are as an early bird?
Sure. Usually my day starts somewhere around 4:30 in the morning. So either kind of check a few emails and then go for a run, get on the bike, do some lifting in this space before the kids get up. So our son Hunter gets up at 6 a.m. So I need to be showered and ready to go by the time he gets up.
Best material to print with, favorite material to print with?
I'm still partial to some of the work I did kind of early on as some of the elastomer materials. I think there's a lot of opportunity in kind of in sporting goods and athletics and protection that I'm excited to see some of those really coming to reality 10 years onwards.
Job as a founder that you would forever outsource if you could?
Accounting. Paying quarterly taxes. So
technology that you're most excited about?
I think I'm excited about Trace, to be selfish and self-promoting.
Yeah. It is your podcast. You can do that.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity there to mine some of the data that's already been created and gain even further insights on the technology.
Okay. Snowboarding or skiing?
Snowboarding.
Person you most want to have as a guest on your podcast?
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about it. Yeah, I don't know. I think I really like my most, I don't have there's no celebrity or anything like that. I really get a kick out of talking to owners or kind of the small, medium-sized kind of companies that have really put everything on the line to start a business. Mm-hmm. I find that those stories really energizing, encouraging, and hearing kind of the true kind of day-to-day life. So I would like to kind of continue to highlight those stories through the podcast.
Okay. Favorite cocktail?
I'd say a sidecar for me. We're bourbon people, so it was a tough choice between sidecar or an old fashioned.
Yeah, the coriander old fashioned is kind of hard to beat.
That's right.
You talked about AMA going back to in-person conferences. Having now done both, do you have a preference, in-person or Zoom?
No, in person.
Best business advice?
Yeah, I think it would be kind of thinking through what's the opportunity in any given situation. So, I mean, there's going to be setbacks, there's going to be challenges, but if you have a mindset that like, okay, what's the opportunity here for me? Is it an opportunity to learn like, hey, like that was a terrible approach. Like, don't ever do that again. Or like, I think just having that outlook and kind of positive spin on whatever situation it is. Because I think early on, certainly I had challenges with doing that and kind of keeping a positive light on getting rejected by a client or not getting feedback from a phone call and things like that, and trying to think more broadly and being patient about kind of when is opportunity, kind of where are there opportunities to do better or succeed or change strategies or learn.
Yeah. Is there a dream project for you?
I think beating an old horse here is kind of I think the Trace stuff has a kind of interesting opportunity to build out something new in the industry. Kind of some of the stuff we spoke about calibration and kind of helping people rapidly qualify their parts.
Okay. Seems like a good place to leave it. Thank you for letting me come on and ask you questions, pretend like I know enough about this to be dangerous in those questions. And I can't wait to see what the next 50 episodes look like.
For sure. Thank you very much and helping me all along this path. And I did not see the questions in advance, so hopefully I did okay.
You did great. You pass. I'm one to judge on these, and you did very well.
Well, thank you.